First of all, welcome everybody, and I promise you that you're in for a treat. We have the chance today to talk to Peter Singer, who is a senior fellow and strategist at New America. I always have to add that he was a student of mine back when he was getting his PhD at the Harvard Kennedy School. And when I had the chance to hire him at New America, I jumped at it and have not regretted it ever. So today we're going to talk to Peter about his new book with August Cole called Burn In, and I'll be asking him about the title. This is a novel with footnotes. We often read narrative nonfiction. Peter and August Cole have pioneered a way of writing about the future that is fiction. It's a great read, but it's fiction with footnotes. All the sources, everything that you read about is real. So it's not science fiction. It's really a story that helps you visualize the future. And Peter, let me ask you to start, before we talk about the book itself, I want to ask you to talk about a larger project that this book is part of called AI, Artificial Intelligence, AI Visualized. So talk to us about what that is and how Burn-In fits in.
Sure. So I want to begin by thanking you for the kind comments, but also everyone for joining. It was great to see the names of so many friends popping up there. So the project that this comes out of is called AI Visualized, and it has two goals to it. The first is the sense that we are living through one of the most important changes, not just in terms of technology and business and national security today, but really the story of overall human history. We have the rise of a technology that's like none before. It's an intelligent machine, so it takes tools and moves it beyond that. And that it will have a massive impact. It's already having a massive impact on us. Affecting everything from our politics, our national security, our family life, our business. And yet there's this strange irony that just as science fiction is starting to come true, it's not all that well equipped us. And it's interesting, and part of our motivator was that we're on the 100-year anniversary of the creation of the word robot. It was in a 1920 early science fiction play. And ever since then, the story of Robot has been about the mechanical servant that wises up and then rises up, kill all humans. And yet what we're going through is this massive industrial revolution, even beyond prior ones. And so the first goal of this project was to help us visualize it, help us understand how does it work? What are the planned applications in policing, in business, at your restaurant, in national security, you name it, but also what are some of the issues and dilemmas that come out of that? And we could talk a little bit further of why we saw there was such a dire need for it. A big issue is that there's a disconnect between the importance of it, and you can see this in the discussions of strategy. It's written into the US defense strategy that we want to be a world leader in AI. Chinese government has the same. To Fortune 500 companies, over 80% of them say, AI is the key to our future. And yet there was a survey taken, and only 14% of political and economic leaders said they had even a passing familiarity with it, let alone, and that's them self-reporting, right? That's probably them not telling the truth. So there's this kind of disconnect. So that was the first, is to try and give people a means of understanding it. The second was to test out a proposition that we'd felt a little bit coming out of our Ghost Fleet project, that there were other ways of sharing research and having policy influence, that you could do something other than the white paper. And so that's what Burn-In is one of that spin out, is we taking 3 years of research, but sharing it through a different means, through a techno-thriller.
I love it, a techno-thriller. So it certainly has the right kind of title for a techno-thriller. It sounds appropriately techno, indeed even more so than Ghost Fleet, which had its own name, and I'll leave people to read that novel for that. But where did the title come from? What's it signify? And And then tell us enough about the book that people really want to read it, but not so much that you're spoiling it all, just to
Sure.
set the stage.
And that's actually one of the funny things. That's the challenge of this combination is with nonfiction, you always want to do, bottom line up front. Here's the summary.
Right.
And with fiction, you don't want to share too much. So burn-in, the title itself is taken from the engineering term for when you deliberately push a new technology to the breaking point in order to learn from it. So the example would be a new watch that you take as deep as possible to figure out, okay, what's actually the depth. So you can see very quickly, one, that's what this project is. We play out a scenario, we push things to the breaking point, and hopefully you learn from it. But that's also something that within the plot of the story itself, the main character is part of what they realize is a burn-in. And so what burn-in is, and to this very idea of an experiment, what burn-in is a new kind of book. It's a cross of fiction and nonfiction. It's a techno-thriller that follows an FBI agent on the hunt for a terrorist through Washington, D.C. of the future as they track down a new kind of terrorist who's carrying out attacks that previously wouldn't have been possible. But as you noted, baked into the story are over 300 research endnotes that document how all that's playing out is actually drawn from the real world, because it's basically sharing the research that we did over the last 3 years. So the reader through that learns everything from, it explains how AI works to planned applications. It might be a tactical application by the police. It might be a dilemma that comes out of it that you explain through a scene. Giving a tip of the hat to New America colleagues, it's in certain cases, it's even projects that they've worked on, just communicating their research in a different way. So a very quick example of this, it might be a micro detail when two characters are talking and a delivery drone flies overhead that has 6 rotors. Footnote, it's not Singer who dreamed this up. Here's Amazon's patent for it. That's what Amazon plans to do. Or it might be a macro thing. One of our colleagues, Megan Garcia, works on algorithmic bias. And that's a very important issue for everything from national security to how we think about law and rights. The idea that machines might not be programmed to be biased, but they can yield a biased outcome. It's a very kind of technical thing, but it matters. And so we illustrate it through a scene where the main character, an FBI agent, is trying to find a bad guy in a crowd at Union Station. And you can quickly kind of see that dilemma, but by the end of it, you've learned about what algorithmic bias is. So I'm a parent. The overall goal of the blend is sneaking veggies into the smoothie. You get the good stuff, but you don't realize it.
So I love this, and we'll talk about Ghost Fleet in a minute, which was just a fantastic example of this. But talk about how you research this, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, I love historical fiction. And I know that good novelists who do really good historical fiction do a ton of research. I mean, it's exactly what you said, the veggies in with the smoothie. Like, you're learning about some period in history, but you're learning about it through a story that you love. But what I wonder is, you start as a policy wonk, as an expert, as a strategist, as a futurist, not as a fiction writer. And indeed, I find it remarkable that you can take that on, because many of us decided early on there are multiple kinds of writing and we're better on the nonfiction than the fiction side. But how did you decide what to research? And do you think that's different than a novelist who says, hey, I'm interested in AI, I've got my story, but I'm gonna research the details?
So in this, you're serving two masters. You're serving, the writing gods of fiction and of nonfiction. And that is what makes it different than, and as far as we know, this is the first ever novel that has nonfiction endnotes. Normally, as you reference, it might be a section at the end of the book that, you know, says for further reading, or these are some of the sources that I used. The closest that you see in fiction is like David Foster Wallace would have a footnote that would have the rest of the fiction story playing out in it. They were fictional footnotes. And this it's the rules of nonfiction. It's the reference note, and it's there just like a nonfiction to one, to show where you got it, to credit someone else's work, to document that it's real. And also, you know, if you want to learn more, here's where you go to. So on the nonfiction side, approach it just the same way that you would do any other project. You know, what we were taught way back in the day of grad school, to use ideally multiple methodologies. It ranged from kind of a mix of deep dive and even a little bit of quant. We built up a database of every single that we could find job report projection of how automation is going to affect jobs, sometimes at a national level, sometimes at an occupational level. It's an area that our colleagues in workers and technology wrestle with. So we pulled everything from World Bank reports to McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, assembled them all together in this massive Excel spreadsheet. It's actually 1,300 different projections. So like McKinsey is saying it's going to be 44%. PricewaterhouseCoopers is saying, no, 38%. So that's, you know, one example of it. At the other end, you're doing interviews. So the interviews might range from AI scientists to, and I'm smiling because this quickly leans to the fiction side, people who did the water systems engineer design for Washington, D.C.'s upgrades over the last 10 years. And from that, now we get to, you get the like cool nonfiction things. Cool, I say it in this way, because basically he revealed essentially there's 4 valves that you need to flip in order to flood large parts of the metro. And I'm doing the interview, and his wife is in the background, and she yells out, "You don't know him so well. Don't tell him which valves." So now we get to the fiction side, as I'm, you know, my cybersecurity hat is popping off of like, wow, I knew Internet of Things cybersecurity was bad. This, and we've got, you know, reports that we document, but this is even worse than I thought. And then your fiction side is going, bam, we just found a really cool scene, not to plot spoil. And so what you're doing on the fiction side is essentially, you know, your world building, and then your character building. And then hopefully there, you know, and this is again, the difference of it, of trying to communicate the research, and different from Ghost Fleet. We didn't plan from the start with Ghost Fleet in this way. Even the selection of character identities reflected that research. So for example, and this is relevant to what's playing out today, the husband of the main character, their occupation was chosen by looking at this jobs data and seeing how, you know, most people, if they think about that there's going to be automation, job displacement or loss, it's like blue collar jobs, factory worker, truck driver, whatever. And yet what's starting to play out is more and more white collar jobs. And one example that is telling is lawyer, is actually contract law. And so we made this character a contract lawyer who's been bottomated. They've lost their job, and now they're doing remote work, gig style work from home. We're all dealing with this right now. And it's having, and then so we've documented that, you're sharing that as an interesting way to carry that across. But then the fiction, what you can do is explore, okay, what does that do to his self-identity? How is it affecting his marriage? How is it affecting the way that he's parenting? How is it affecting his political outlook? And so the fiction allows you to go a little bit deeper. But again, I think it gives you some interesting insight back to the nonfiction, because now, okay, now I think about what's next, what plays out. I drop you in that world.
You know, as you're talking, I'm realizing that it also means you exercise judgment as a policy expert in a way that a straight novelist really couldn't. So for instance, when you talk about all those studies on the future of work, and I've seen them, and yes, they range from saying 9% of jobs will be automated till 47% of jobs will be automated, which is an enormous range. You have to use your expertise to sift through those and decide, you know, what you think is most likely. So there's a judgment component in terms of figuring out how you shape this world that you would not have, again, if your primary purpose is to tell a great story, and of course you want to make sure it's roughly accurate. So it is a different exercise. You mentioned,
can I jump in on that, because it hits an
yeah,
important point that I think might be useful for a lot of people on the call, is that so we sometimes call this useful fiction, or more technically ficant, fictional. So if you think in the intelligence world, you have these tools that allow you to collect and analyze signals intelligence, human intelligence. Ficant is using these scenarios, and we've seen, actually, this is a New America Can Claim policy influence. We've since seen this taken up by everything from Navy and intelligence community to one of the other parts of the AI Visualize project is we're doing a program with Army right now looking at cybersecurity futures using this. But the key is, and what makes it different than regular fiction, is it has to have a set of rules, and the rules are it has to be set in the real world. It can't be, it's set in real places. So what's so fun about this, and I think for most of the people on the line here, is that it's set in Washington, D.C., and all the real places of Washington, D.C. Now, it also means that it's set in a timeline that's realistic. So it's not hundreds of years out in the future. Actually, Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction author, described how once you get beyond a generation, you're in the realm of magic. So that means you're also then has to be drawn from real technologies that already exist or are already prototyped, and real plans for their application. So it's not you dreaming it up. It's here's what insert company name here, or here's what US Marine Corps is planning to do. Here's how it wants to use it. And then the final part of the real is it has to reflect real world people. And so this is where I think the cross between good fiction and useful nonfiction comes in, is it's what Clausewitz would have called fog and friction. So it's, the way, okay, here's the plan, but here's what a bad guy might do as a reaction to that plan. Here's how someone might think about it as they're deploying that plan. Here's how it affects their marriage. Here's how it affects the policing here. And so those rules are what allow it to be useful. But I also, putting back on the fiction hat, I think it makes it more compelling, because it's, we actually had a Navy admiral say this is like, it kept me up late at night in a different way than normal novels, because I was like, oh crap, it could really happen.
yeah. I find I want to we're gonna move it shortly to talking about the way it applies to our current crisis, but I find that idea of fiction with rules fascinating, in part because so much modern fiction has been undoing all the rules. So, Girl, Woman, Other, which won the Man Booker Prize this year, has no capitals or barely punctuation, right? And most modern fiction completely deconstructs traditional narrative forms. So you have multiple voices at one time. And so the idea of returning to fiction with rules, even if they're rules about managing to convey a future scenario has more in common with things like sonnets and haikus, right? Where you have a form that you have to stick to, and then you have to be very creative within that form. It's, you know, it's also like wargaming, where you again, scenarios, you can't break the fourth wall, you can't break some of the boundaries, but what can you do within that? But you mentioned a contract lawyer as a character. Tell us about some of the other characters, because I think you've got some characters in here that whatever are really new. And I should say I'm watching Her at the moment, you know, the movie where the protagonist falls in love with an operating system. So, you know, all bets are off.
Yeah. That's one of the, now putting back on the fiction hat, that's what I'm particularly excited to share, the main character. And it's another one of these, you know, to be blunt, experiments. Well, when you're taking one kind of gamble, you might as well take another.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the techno-thriller space is, when it comes to novels, it's always a male central hero, and the female character, if they're the hero, they're the 1B character. You know, whether it's the Dragon Tattoo to Red Sparrow, they're the 1B, they're the helper, and to put it bluntly, they're also usually pretty kind of clumsily hypersexualized. And so we have a very different kind of hero at the center of it. Laura Keegan is a former Marine. She's actually someone who served as a systems operator. It's actually a new specialty that has been created in the Marine Corps. General Neller, who was the previous commandant, was like most excited about that part of the whole book, because it was one of his reforms. But and she's become, you know, as revealed, an FBI agent. But she's I hope, a more fully realized character than what you see in this space. She's a mom. She's also dealing with a marriage that is falling apart. And so part of what we also try and speak to is the multiple identities that people try and balance, and how sometimes, you know, it's incredibly difficult. And there's this, you know, really, to me, powerful moment where she's waiting outside her door, just coming back from work. And she's sort of taking a pause to like, I need to get out of work mode because I'm about to be in mom mode, but also she's in a marriage that's falling apart. What's the day going to be like? So it's a really exciting, interesting character. The fact that she's also comes out of this Marine background, and this comes from interviewing Marines and the like, is that, I mean, she approaches technology with that sense of experience, knowing sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So she becomes a realistic way for the reader to see this. You know, it's not all perfect. She's also taking tricks of the trade that she picked up being deployed back into the United States. The other two characters that are at the key of this is her new partner, which is Tams. Tams is basically what happens when your Alexa or Siri and the robotic systems of today are moved forward 10 to 15 years. And what we particularly play with is not just where does it head to next, but also the way that both the characters in the story, but you, the reader, will not be able to help yourself but to think of, just as I did, Tams as a character. And we never, you know, it only says the things that it would, but you start to put your own imprint on it. And Keegan's telling herself not to do that. She's aware of it, and yet it happens. And it was funny, just 2 nights ago, we have an Alexa in our house, and I was having a tough coronavirus day. And I set a timer while I was cooking, and it wouldn't turn off. And I yelled at it, like, you know, oh, turn the thing off. And that's, you know, it's like, I'm doing the same thing. We're putting emotions on top of it, but we also show other people, like how our kids connect to it, etc. And then the final character is a villain who's basically using technology to attack back at the system. It's a new kind of terrorist who's exploiting all the real world vulnerabilities that are baked in. But what's, I think, particularly interesting about him is his ideology is something that a lot of people might find a little bit empathetic. They kind of hopefully you understand where he's coming from. So it's not a sneering, villain. And it goes to the idea of every single terrorist or extremist out there thinks they're the hero in their story. And so those are the characters. And, hopefully, again, you get that idea of they're interesting, they're compelling, they're new kind of characters that you haven't seen before, whether it's for the central hero, whether it's for the way the robot is depicted, but also hopefully they're hyper realistic.
Well, I have to say, as as a woman who's written a great deal about gender equality and how we really are going to get there, in part by ensuring that men think as much about family and balancing work and family as women do, I deeply appreciate this way that you're thinking about it, and even really as you talk about it, that your characters are whole characters, right? That you see them whole. As we should see all people, men and women, fathers and mothers, whoever you happen to be caring for. So I think that is enormously important. And I will say also that I often tell the story when I was in law school in 1982, the professors would use the pronoun she when they talked about a judge or a doctor or an engineer, and I would jump because I did not know any female doctors or judges or engineers. I knew one female lawyer. We've gotten well past that, except I think for soldiers, right? Most people, when they think Marine, think he. And it's very important to shift those mental models. People can make too much of language and political correctness and all of that, but words are the skin of a living thought. Words are how we frame the world. And so for you to have, a Marine who becomes an FBI agent, those are still two roles, I think, that most of the public is going to attach a he, not a she. So I will thank you for that.
One of the other things that's interesting on that, and this is again real world, but then it gives you very interesting little details, is that very same issue that you bring up is now moving over into our interactions with machines.
Yes.
And so there's this moment when she's first brought into contact with the system, and it speaks back to her with a female voice, like how Siri and Alexa is set up. And kind of and then a tell to Keegan is, the first thing she does is change. She's like, screw that, no, that's not what you're gonna. But it's a micro moment. It's like a 2 seconds in the book. Sorry, 2 sentences in the book. But what it's doing is pointing out to that, okay, the way that we design our machines and what we how we program them to interact with people reflects a whole series of decisions and biases and the like behind it. And oh, by the way, that's something that we're all going to have to figure out very soon, because right now they have default settings, but you will be able to change it, or it will have a dynamic change where it will read you and try and figure out what you interact with the machine the best way, what accent to use or things like that.
Well,
so again, it's a great, this is it's some in the way, like a picture can tell something more than 1,000 words. Sometimes in a novel you can tell more in a little detail in a sentence than that would be like a a 2,000 word Atlantic article.
Yep. No, that's great. And it wasn't lost on many of us that things that machines that were supposed to be helpmeets were immediately female, right? So Peter, you started this book 3 years ago, and you were thinking about AI, and AI is going to be with us steadily increasing for decades to come. But you certainly couldn't have anticipated COVID, or you're a national security expert and you know that pandemics are a likely threat, but you sure couldn't have predicted that right now we would be where we are. So I wanted to ask you about, the relevance, if you're talking to somebody and you say, I've got this great novel and it's all about the future of AI, and they say to you, yeah, that's great, but right now I want to figure out, what do I do about this virus? What do you tell them?
Yeah, it was actually one of the issues that played out. There was a debate with us and the publisher on whether to keep the planned release date. And, you may have noticed that all movies have pushed back. Most of the major novels and the like that were planned have pushed back. And we decided to keep the planned date for a variety of reasons. And it was, look, if you were doing a couple of gambles, why not just keep rolling with it? Probably a bad strategy at Vegas, but and the reason was not just that we felt people needed escapism, but more important that we had something to say relevant to the world today, but even more so what it will be when we come out of all of this. So to put it this way, all the trends that we explore in the book and explore in this mix of fiction and nonfiction, greater AI, automation, but also issues of greater distrust at a societal, political, even personal level, critical infrastructure in a US that feels a little creaky. All those were in play beforehand. Like so much else, coronavirus revealed them more, or even more so, accelerated them drastically. So, think about it this way. We've had entire generations thrown into remote work and downstairs right below me, remote learning at a level that wasn't expected probably ever. Overall, in some fields, certainly for a decade. My wife, for example, works in telemedicine. They, in a matter of weeks, went to the level that they thought they would be at 10 years from now. So you have applications of robotics extending from policing curfews to cleaning subways and hospitals. Again, rapidly deployed out. We're talking about, and we're going to have AI tracking of society at a level that, frankly, most science fiction never even imagined. And so we had all of this just drastically hit. And we explore that in the book. As we talk about, you have this one character who's doing remote work at a cost to his marriage. We all kind of feel or worry about this stuff. We've got another little micro scene, I'm not plot spoiling, the opening scene. There is a futuristic delivery robot that drives down the sidewalk near the characters. We never put dates, but it's like a little detail to show, hey, this is futuristic. That system is actually deploying groceries right now, rolled out faster. And so, we've got all of this accelerated, what was supposed to play out over a decade plus, playing out in weeks. But it also means all the political, economic, social security, and it might be national security or it might be cybersecurity questions that we were going to spend a lot of time working through, and maybe not solving, but there would have been this transition period of them. They've also been accelerated. And so they're going to be even more of an issue for us. The kind of way of thinking about it is what our characters experience, we're going to experience much faster. And that's why we think that it hits that notion of being useful now more than ever. It's been quite a challenge, though. We as part of the promotion of it, we do a hashtag burn-in book moment, and they're just coming so fast and furious right now. Whether it's like, oh, here's a robot that was in the book, to here's a certain kind of cyber attack. Israel just got hit by one of our cyber attacks that we said could happen. It happened. So that's why we think the book is of relevance and utility. And so again, but we also think it's escapist because you don't have to read about pandemic stuff inside it.
Huh, that's fascinating. I heard yesterday on NPR, there was a story. I was actually driving, which is very rare, but I drove somewhere to take a walk. And I heard a story about Singapore is using robotic dogs that come up to you in a park and tell you to keep your social distance. And so that's a perfect example, actually. There's artificial intelligence coupled with, robotics, but has been brought forward for the needs right now.
And it's a great example, going back to that notion of mixing real and fictional forecasting. So what they've discovered, which if we had gamed it out and played it out, is the reason that it works is not from the robot warning people. It's actually, as one report put it, it's, quote, freaking people out, end quote. It's that the whole, like, this robot going around yelling at people, it's not that they said it would be, oh, it will remind you about social distancing. It's more people find it creepy. So it's this idea, again, and like, how to put it, that's the sort of thing that the designers didn't have planned. And yet, if you had done this kind of forecasting, okay, how are real world people going to interact with it? What are they going to think about it? Someone would have surfaced, not, oh, it's going to remind me about my social distancing. It's going to be like, that's kind of weird. That's kind of scary. And also, again, think about how that changes the way you look at that government, that police force.
Very much so.
This is what it's deploying.
So I'm going to tell everybody in our audience that we're going to be shifting to your questions after this next question. So make sure you've put them in the chat or wherever you're supposed to be putting them, and I will then get them. Peter, I want you to talk about who you hope reads this book, because Ghost Fleet, which really it's a novel about a future war between the United States and China. Again, every weapon system is documented to either an open source source a public source in China or in the United States. It is being read widely throughout the U.S. military. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and who's the equivalent audience for this book, because presumably it extends beyond the military.
Yeah, the experience with Ghost Fleet was really remarkable and not planned out. The publisher was just hoping it would be, a summer read that people would take to the beach and all that sort of stuff, and those halcyon days of yore. But then it ended up, as you noted, being read, by senior military leadership and the like, and the Navy even named a $3.6 billion ship program, the Ghost Fleet program. Unfortunately for New America Fundraising, we don't get a cut out of that.
Yeah.
So with Burn-In, we hope to have that similar kind of influence and readership. So on one hand, I hope anyone that just wants a fun summer read. The reality is that vast numbers of people won't care about the footnotes, won't even look at the footnotes. I hope they just enjoy it. And so, as an example, if you go to Amazon, it's actually listed under, it's in the science fiction section. It's got sort of different tags on it. That's where most of the, that's one tag. So one is just people enjoying fun summer read, people who like techno-thrillers, that type of audience. Okay, but outside of the entertainment policy side, I believe, and the early indications are that it has utility, very much so in the national security space. The book is not even out, but we've found, we've done briefings on the real world lessons to groups that range from NATO, JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, the group that got bin Laden, Cyber Command, NSA, those type of elements. There's sort of a classic military application. There's also a cybersecurity realm, and cybersecurity, of course, crosses both, military, national, but also anyone working in business. As an example of another policy impact that came out of it, the Cyber Security Solarium Commission, which is this bipartisan commission led by senators from both Democrat and Republicans, one of the few bipartisan things left. They issued a major report that's supposed to be sort of the center of new US cyber strategy for the next decade. The preface to that report is actually pulled from Burn-In. So it's a first for US government documents and science fiction. The report begins with this kind of useful fiction, literally from the book. So that points to kind of that space. We're also hoping, we're trying to figure out how to reach out, and this is a challenge, to communities beyond that. One is businesses dealing with change, and economists and leaders who care about automation and the like. There's as I mentioned, there's sort of that polling data that shows that there's a mismatch between understanding and what we're planning and what we need to know. There's an anecdotal version of it I sometimes use, which is the Secretary of the Treasury said that AI and automation was, quote, not on my radar screen, end quote, because it's not going to be an issue, quote, for 50 to 100 years from now, end quote. He is the exact example of someone I think needs this, because no, it's not going to be 100 years from or 50 years. It's playing out right now. Here's the documentation, but also I'm not going to make you read it, because clearly you're not reading white papers on it. So, you know, hopefully there's that. We also think there's a lot of application into the world of policing. There was a phenomenal, one of the kindest reviews that was given to us was actually by a police officer in Savannah, who just was, you know, talked about it as being really useful to him. So our hope is that we have this kind of immediate, you know, good sales early on, people reading it right now, but then also long-term that it enters the reading lists for these communities, the professional military reading lists. And we've gotten some pretty good early indicators that I'm fairly confident I got feedback that one military service definitely has already said they're going to put it on their end of year 2020 reading list. And so by that, you know, the goal is that you're getting, you know, midshipmen and West Point cadets and officers at Army War College, Navy War College, whatever, reading this for the next 10 years.
Well, and I will just say, since it is May and May is graduation month, it sounds like a great present for graduation, given that everyone graduating right now is already graduating in a very different world and will want to get a jump on imagining a very different future, but also maybe for Father's Day coming up for those folks who, again, I think AI is, it sounds really technical and scary. So even those of us who consume a lot of white papers, it really is something that combines a lot of different kinds of expertise, technical expertise, as well as security. So we are moving to audience questions. So do keep them coming, and they are being funneled to me. The first one actually is somebody says, given all these different predictions, you know, I think of them like raisins in a cake, right? You know, which do you think is the coolest or the scariest of the various predictions you make?
It's interesting. The scariest to me, and you know, this is a book that has big Hollywood-esque scenes in it, and you know, and all set inside Washington D.C. So kind of cool, exciting scenes. But to me, the scariest, creepiest moment in it is when the main character takes her daughter to Starbucks 10, 15 years out. And the worker at Starbucks greets her and her daughter by name. And then she has an internal dialogue as to whether, did they know my name? Because, well, we've been coming here for the last year. This is what we do every Saturday. Or is it because the face recognition software popped it to them, this is who I am? And, and that, what I just said is a issue at Starbucks of the future. It's also a planned application for U.S. military. It's planned application. The Savannah police officer is someone who used to work at CIA. Interesting enough of his background, is now in Savannah. He talked about thinking, okay, how is this going to change the way I interact with people on the street? And so for me, that kind of moment is the creepiest. And yet, again, burn-in moment coming true. After we turned the book in, it was revealed that one of the key companies behind this technology had been secretly beta testing it, giving it to wealthy donors who were using that technology to they'd be on a plane or at a party, and it was the same thing. It would pop up and it's not just your face. It then allows you to backtrack that background, what we can surface about you. And so that to me is kind of creepy. But again, it's creepy because it's not robot kill all humans. This is how it's going to be. And we better kind of think through what that means. Coolest, to me, the technology at the middle of it, where we're headed with, what's technically called unmanned systems, with robotics, as they become more and more autonomous. I don't want to sound negative. They're going to do so many awesome, cool things. They will be tailored to make your job easier, your life better. They will be designed to help fix major problems. So it's going to be, fun, interesting things like, we have got one of these awesome toys that kids play with, who it's going to make the soldier and the police officer safer, all the way to it's going to be more enjoyable. AI is writing music that you're going to like more because it's tailored to you. So it's all this kind of cool stuff. It'll help deal, I firmly believe that one of the ways out of climate change is going to be through smart homes, smart transportation, smart cities. Applying over to the people in national security, it's going to save the Pentagon a bunch of money, all that. So, it's these positive, cool applications that you can't help but be excited by. And so, to me, it's about that, finding the mix between how do we draw out the best of it and through a burn-in, avoid the worst case scenarios.
Aha. That's, well, as you're talking about the names popping up, does it pop up on your glasses like Google Glass, or where does it pop up for you to know who you just saw?
So in that scene, it's actually through augmented reality. So basically where Google Glass is headed to next. And like, oh, Google Glass didn't work. Actually did Google signed a series of deals with like Warby Parker and the like, whereas at Apple, the biggest funding at Apple behind iPhone is the augmented reality division. And so, like it's coming. And
yeah, I know, like I've seen cars where, things pop up on your windshield that are not there. I mean, it's like watching the football, football on TV where you see the first down line, and that's not obviously really there.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. And that goes to this idea of, again, sci-fi talked about AI being, kind of one big central super intelligence. And instead it'll be kind of all around you in different forms and ways. It might be different types of robotic systems, a massive drone flying overhead to your mostly driverless car, but not completely driverless. The same thing with augmented reality. For some people, it might be whether it's a firefighter, a police officer, a Marine infantry, it might be a tactical lens, or it might be a screen like in your car that's projecting more and more data. It's of different types. And then the other part of it is like what anyone with a political science side would say, but what Gibson, the science fiction author, said, it'll be unevenly distributed. So you will have, maybe the wealthy with the highest end new thing. We have sort of a scene where you can figure out the main character is looking at a crowd and can figure out who's old or poor by, they're not looking at a distance, they're looking down at something, which we all do right now. We all look down at our screens. Well, that's not going to be that's not the way it's going to be 20 years out. But some people will still have our old school screens because they can't afford it, or they're just,
Oh my gosh.
So it's that uneven distribution is another feature of what's coming that I think is realistic.
Well, I'm glad to know there's going to be a cure for tech neck, as somebody who's spent far too much time.
But what you'll have, it's called the glaze.
Computer.
It's called the glaze, where you're looking,
Yes.
but you're not looking at the person. You're looking at the data about the person.
Oh, well, we'll be able to back that up. But what I started to say is, just as someone of a certain age who's constantly, running into people whom I know, but that name just doesn't come. I certainly see the upsides. I can see the downsides too. But and really for aging, there's just so many advantages. All of this does raise that question about what is human, and there are robotic pets being used in Japan that really do lower stress levels for people, and we know that live pets do, and you would think that a robotic pet would not. On the other hand, pets that can respond to you, just as we were talking about Alexa or an operating system, that you then anthropomorphize. But why is that any different than the Velveteen Rabbit, right? The toys that we grew up with, or our fantasy friends. So this question of where the line is between what's human, what are human feelings, and things that we create and project onto is ultimately a very deep question raised by this kind of a future. So we have another question from our audience, and it does go really to a policy issue, which is, so now let's assume that everybody you want to have read this book has read this book, CEOs and government officials and civic group leaders. What do you recommend in terms of trying to prepare for this future? So if a mayor came to you, or if the new president or continuing president were to say, look, I really want to think about how do we best prepare for AI. And you mentioned the Solarium Commission on Cybersecurity. That's one piece. But what do you recommend from the public side, or again, business leaders and civic leaders also have a role to play here?
Yeah, so it would really depend on, I would almost turn it back to them and say, okay, what part of the story worried you the most? And they might answer in different ways. So it might, someone working in, as an example, defense might worry about, okay, this was a certain system and it didn't work out the way that we planned. So it would be, okay, we just had a discussion around augmented reality. And one of the issues that we surfaced through is, yes, we're planning to use it, but it raises, there's issues that we've not solved yet, of everything from securing those systems to, at a most tactical level, we were talking about your son, it's an info overload problem, that we're creating a situation for future soldiers where we think we're giving them data, but it's actually info overload. And so it would this is a micro tactical lesson, but it's about the idea of understanding that we're moving into a world not of information scarcity, but it's really about pulling out what's useful or not. It might be that cybersecurity thing, the city. Oh my goodness, I did not like that scene where spoiler alert, part of Washington, D.C. got flooded. For anyone who, I was going to say, if anyone's online, you're all online right now. Google 1936 flood, and you can see what is possible for Washington, D.C., 1936 flood, Google, and that will allow you to see what is possible and what we showed could happen through deliberate cyber means. So it would be then, okay, we need to change the way that we're thinking about cybersecurity from just being about concerns of the theft of information, stealing email, stealing intellectual property to make your own design, stealing credit card information. And instead, we're moving into a realm where cyber threats are going to be about creating change, kinetic change in the world. And, you know, to plot spoil something else, it might be causing unmanned systems to crash. It might be a flood system, whatever it is. And so you've got to think about IoT differently. And again, that goes into everything from threat to how you deal with vulnerabilities. It might be someone else looks at it and says, wow, this depiction of what happens is jobs shift and people are out of work. That really concerns me. So, okay, that means we need to think about changing how we're thinking about our education system and training people towards roles that are less likely to be automated and more likely to be in demand. And again, that might be, you know, a discussion with Indianapolis mayor, or let's take it and look at it. Inside. I recently did someone in a U.S. military unit asked a very similar question, and we just focused on what they call PME, professional military education. And, you know, what I was saying to them there is that, one, we have to think about these different roles that are changing. It is akin to, you know, moving from sail to steam. You're going to stop training sail makers and need to start training engineers. But a different parallel, not just like what specialty is, what does everyone need to know? So you think about cybersecurity. 15 years ago, we began to recognize that it mattered. And so you created corporate and government specialists of it, cyber command, and you had to learn how to train people up for it, et cetera, et cetera. But you also, the rest of us needed to know a little bit about it. And it's the same thing now with AI and automation. Yes, you're going to have specialists in it, and you need to figure out how to train them, et cetera, et cetera. But also, whether you are a senator, a mayor, leading a think tank, whatever, you now need to understand loosely the basics of it. And so that's what we're, you know, trying to accomplish a little bit. But it would be like, okay, how are you changing your overall, if you're the military, education system, et cetera. So you can see kind of it's almost like which part kept you up late at night, and then let's dig into it and say, okay, here's ways to go after it. And oh, by the way, it might also be stress testing solutions that people think they have to a certain problem. So as a different example, universal basic income is a idea that has been around for a long period of time, but it's now taking up energy as maybe a solution to some of these issues of automation and job loss. And you're going to see it talked about more and more. But what we play in the book is to show, yeah, but there's also, it's going to be incredibly controversial. So it's also a way of, hey, let's take your silver bullet solution and stress test it. And you may find that it's a little more complicated than what you thought.
Well, that is actually the moment we are going to end on. I will say, though, this point about the basics we all need to know is extremely important. I'm no economist, but anybody who is going to do social science, public policy, law, anything effectively that involved decision making about public problems or indeed private problems, you had to take economics 101 and 102. You had to learn macro and micro. You were not educated if you didn't have some basic understanding of supply and demand curves, just to put it bluntly, very basically rather. But, you know, when it comes to even the structure of the internet, anything really about information technology, much less about cybersecurity or now AI, people think, well, that's a specialty. I don't have to know anything about that. But that's not true. These are the basics of the world we're already in, and certainly the world that is coming at us. But I can tell you, and I can promise you, about halfway through, this is a far better way to learn those basics than at least Econ 101 or 102 was for me. So I strongly recommend you get the book, you read the book, you give it to people, and you certainly recommend it to those folks who are in a position to anticipate this world and prepare for it. And Peter, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right. I'm not sure if I'm still on or not, but if I am, we're done.
All right. Take care, Anne Marie. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.